She was 19 years old, and she had $31 after paying the county its $1 for the Woolshed on Fleece Hollow Road. The Woolshed had been on the delinquent property register for 18 years. It had been listed 4 times. Twice, no one came. Once a buyer came and left when he saw the condition of the shearing board. Once a conservation organization made an inquiry and then decided the building was too far from their service area to manage. The county dropped the price to $1 and listed it a 4th time and left it there. Then Evie Mast sat down in the assessor's office on a Thursday morning and pushed a single dollar bill across the counter and said she wanted the deed. The clerk, a soft-spoken woman named Odette, who had spent 11 years at that counter, and who had the particular stillness of a person who has seen enough of the world's variety to find most of it interesting rather than alarming, had looked at the dollar and then at Evie and said, "You've been out to see it?" Evie said she had. Odette said, "And you know about the shearing pit?" Evie said she knew about it from the listing. Odette said, "The listing doesn't say what's in it." Evie had looked at her then, the way she looked at things when something unexpected had just become available. She said, "What's in it?" Odette said, "I don't know. But the previous owner left instructions that it wasn't to be opened by anyone who hadn't purchased the property." Her estate attorney was very specific. She slid the deed across the counter. "The combination is in an envelope in the property file. I'm supposed to give it to the new owner." Evie picked up her dollar. She put it back in her pocket. She took the deed instead. And then she took the envelope, and she drove back out to Fleece Hollow Road. And what she found at the bottom of that shearing pit would not just change the terms of her life. It would change what she understood about the relationship between a person and their land, between a craft and its place of origin, between a woman who had died alone on a hill farm in the uplands and a 19-year-old girl who had been given 3 weeks' notice to vacate a room that had never quite been hers. If this kind of story finds you at the right moment, we're glad this one found you tonight. Please subscribe to Quiet Road Stories, the button is right below, and drop a comment to tell us where you're watching from. We love knowing where our listeners are. Now let's go back to where Evie Mast's story begins. She had grown up in the eastern end of the county, in a house that was, in its bones, a good house, and in its atmosphere, a complicated one. Her father, Glenn Mast, was a cabinet maker of the kind that the trade produces occasionally, genuinely gifted, locally celebrated, chronically disappointed in everything that was not his own work. He held his craft to a standard that was both his pride and his affliction, and he held the people around him to the same standard without distinguishing between wood and people, which was an error of category that produced, over decades, a household in which everyone was perpetually falling slightly short. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose standards were so finely calibrated that they could not include warmth without risk of imprecision, and he had never found a way around that. Her mother, Ruth, had been a warm woman before she had spent 22 years being warm in the proximity of precision, and what remained of her warmth was real and also careful, expressed in the gaps between Glenn's opinions, in the margins of his attention, in the quiet and slightly conspiratorial tenderness she directed at Evie when Glenn was occupied with something else. It was enough. It was not enough. Evie had learned to take what was available and be grateful for it, and honest with herself about its limits. She had a younger brother, Thomas, who had inherited their father's eye and their father's manner in approximately equal measure, and who was therefore at 19 years old already occupying the chair at the right hand of the workshop in a way that made clear, to everyone, including Evie, that the business's future had a shape and she was not in it, not because Glenn had said so, because the gravity of the thing had settled in a particular direction, and gravity does not require announcement. Evie had worked at the garden center from the time she was 16, the same garden center that appears in other stories in other counties, or something like it, because garden centers attract people who are good with their hands and interested in growing things and willing to work in cold and heat with equal application, which is a particular kind of person, and the kind Evie was. Her supervisor, a patient man named Heck, who had been growing plants for 40 years and who talked to them on the premise that they responded, had told her she had what he called a listening eye, that she looked at plants the way a doctor looks at a patient, not to admire them, but to understand what they were telling you about what they needed. She had not known, at 16, what to do with that observation. She had filed it. She had saved $680 over 3 years. She had plans. The plans became urgent in November of her 19th year, when Glenn sat down at the kitchen table. It is always the kitchen table, it seems, in these stories, because the kitchen table is where households conduct their real business, and told her, in the tone he used for woodworking assessments, that he thought it was time for her to try her hand at independence. He did not say she had to leave. He said it was time to try. The difference was subtle and in practice immaterial. Her mother, who was making something at the counter that did not require the attention she was giving it, said quietly, "Glenn," he said, "she's capable." Ruth and her mother said nothing further, because she had spent 22 years learning where the margin was. Evie said she understood. She said she would be out by the end of the month. She was out in 11 days, which was not speed but preference. She left on her own terms or not at all. She took the money and the tools she had bought herself, and the notebook she kept, and a set of botanical illustrations she had done over 3 winters because something had to be done in the evenings, and drawing had turned out to be the thing. And she drove to the county seat and found a room above a laundromat for $210 a month, and moved in and assessed the gap. The gap was significant. $680 minus the first month's rent, plus the deposit left her with $260. She had the garden center job, and she picked up evening shifts at a diner where she cleared tables and occasionally helped with the prep work when the kitchen was short, which it often was. She was building back toward the margin, carefully, in the way she did everything. She found the county delinquent register in the way that everyone in these stories finds it, not by accident, but by the specific gravity of urgency focusing attention on possibilities that had previously seemed abstract. She was at the county library on a Saturday afternoon, reading about small-scale agricultural enterprises because the idea of growing things, of doing the work she was already doing but for herself rather than for wages, had been occupying her mind with increasing insistence. A link on the county agricultural extension page had taken her to the assessor's office website, and she had followed it without particular expectation and found the tab and started reading. The Woolshed was halfway down the list, former sheep station and wool processing shed. Fleece, Hollow Road, 64 acres. Main Woolshed building with attached skirting table and shearing board. Separate stone enclosures for flock management. Delinquent taxes $7,220. Transfer price $1. Note, shearing pit sealed by previous owner. Combination for access provided to new owner only per estate instruction. She read the entry 4 times. She drove to Fleece Hollow Road the next morning. The road climbed into upland country she had not been in before, the kind of country that opens up above the tree line and becomes something else. Larger, more exposed. The sky taking up more of the available space. The land rolling in long waves that spoke of grassland rather than woodland, of something that had been grazed for generations. The Woolshed appeared around a curve, where the track crossed a low ridge, a long, low building of stone and timber, its corrugated iron roof still largely intact though rusted in patches, its sides open in the traditional Woolshed manner along the working length, and partially boarded on the weather end. The shearing board, the slatted wooden floor on which the shearing work was done, was visible through the open side, and she could see from the road that it was warped in places and it split in others, which was what the listing had meant by condition. She got out and walked to the building and went in. The smell was extraordinary. 18 years of vacancy, and the woolshed still smelled of lanolin. The deep, warm, slightly animal sweetness of raw wool. The oil that comes out of fleece and soaks into every surface it touches and simply stays. She had smelled lanolin before, at the garden center, in the hand cream she kept at the register. But she had not smelled it like this, concentrated into the very structure of a building that had processed wool for decades, soaked through the timber of the shearing board and the stone of the walls and the iron of the roof. A smell that was specific and ancient and not unpleasant, and that was, she understood, the smell of what the building was for. She walked the length of the building. At the far end, where the shearing board ended and the floor returned to packed earth, she found the shearing pit. It was exactly what the name described. A rectangular pit cut into the earth floor, roughly 8 feet long by 4 feet wide and 5 feet deep. Stone-lined like all the pits in these stories, fitted with a wooden ladder on one end. Shearing pits were used to position the shearer below the level of the sheep, allowing the shearer to work on an animal standing on the board above without bending, a technique that had been used in certain regional shearing traditions and was now uncommon. This pit was fitted with a timber platform at the bottom, and the platform had a hatch in it, and the hatch had a combination padlock through its hasp. The hatch. Not the pit. The pit had been a working pit. What was in the envelope was the combination for the hatch beneath the platform. She drove to the assessor's office, and she sat across from Odette, and she paid her $1, and she asked for the envelope. She drove back to Fleece Hollow Road. She descended the ladder into the pit. She crouched on the timber platform. She set the combination from the envelope, and the padlock opened. She lifted the hatch. Beneath it, in a dry stone cavity that had been built into the base of the pit lining, a deliberate excavation, stone coursed, sealed from moisture by a layer of slate fitted at the ceiling of the cavity, was a collection of objects arranged with extreme care on wooden shelving built for the purpose. She lifted herself back up and sat on the edge of the pit and looked down into the hatch opening. Then, she went back down. Please stay with us. This is the moment Evie Mast's story changes direction completely, and we'd love for you to be subscribed to Quiet Road Stories before we get there. The button is just below. The hatch is open. The cavity is below. Whatever is on those shelves has been there for 18 years. Let's find out what it is. She worked in the pit for the rest of the afternoon, bringing objects up one by one through the hatch, setting them on the shearing board in the fading light from the open side of the woolshed. The shelves held wool, not raw fleece, processed wool, prepared in different ways, each preparation wrapped in undyed linen cloth and labeled with a small card in a handwriting she was seeing for the first time, angular, economical. Each letter formed as if the pen were a working tool, and not to be wasted on embellishment. The preparations ranged from washed raw fleece to carded roving to spun singles to plied yarn to finished woven samples, each stage of the processing represented, each labeled with the wool's provenance, breed of sheep, year of fleece, what had been done to it, and in what sequence. There were 26 preparations in total. Beside the preparations, on a separate shelf, were tools, hand cards, a set of combs, a drop spindle, a small rigid heddle loom no larger than a book, and a box of natural dye materials, dried plant material, mineral compounds, a small jar of mordant, each labeled in the same hand. And at the back of the cavity, laid flat on the lowest shelf, a package wrapped in the same undyed linen as the wool preparations, tied with undyed wool yarn. She brought it up last. She opened it on the shearing board in the last of the light. Inside the linen was a notebook, not thin, not thick, the cover plain board, the pages dense with the same angular writing she had been reading on the cards. On the first page, in slightly larger letters than the entries that followed, wool from this land. Mowbray Sound. Fleece Hollow Farm. Begun 1971. Beneath the notebook, a letter, folded once. It said, "I have kept sheep on this land for 44 years. The wool from these particular animals, on this particular grass, with this particular weather and this particular water, is different from wool produced anywhere else that I know of. I have spent my working life learning why and what to do with it. What is on these shelves is the record of that learning. Every preparation represents a decision about breed, about processing, about color, about structure, that I made after years of work on this land with these animals. The notebook contains the reasoning behind every decision. It is not a how-to guide. It is an account of a conversation between a farmer and her wool that has been going on for 4 decades. I am leaving this under the shearing pit because the pit is the lowest point of the working floor, the place the work descended to. And because whoever is willing to go down into it to find out what is there is the kind of person who does not stop at the surface. I have not had much patience, in my life, for people who stop at the surface. The loom and the tools are the tools I learned on. Use them or don't. But read the notebook before you decide what this work is for. I grew old here without heirs, which sounds sad from the outside, and from the inside is simply the shape my life took. I do not regret it. I regret that the wool work will stop when I stop. I am doing what I can about that. M. Sound Evie read the letter in the last of the afternoon light in the woolshed that she had owned for approximately 6 hours. She read it again. She sat on the shearing board with the 26 linen-wrapped preparations arranged in their labeled order beside her, and the tools laid out, and the notebook in her lap, and the letter in her hand, and she thought about a woman who had spent 44 years in conversation with her land and her animals, and who had decided, in the face of having no one to pass it to put it in the lowest part of the building, and trust that the right person would go down far enough to find it. She thought about her father's kitchen table. She thought about what he had said about trying her hand at independence, which had seemed at the time like a category of dismissal, and which was now, 6 hours into owning a woolshed on 6 acres of upland grassland, beginning to look like something else entirely. She went back down into the pit and made sure she had brought everything up. She had. She went back up and latched the hatch and climbed out of the pit and stood in the woolshed in the growing dark and looked at what she had arranged on the shearing board. She read the notebook that night by the light of her phone, sitting on the floor of the woolshed in her sleeping bag. She read slowly, which was not her natural speed, and which she imposed on herself, because she understood that fast reading would cost her more than time. The notebook was, as Mowbray Sound's letter had described it, an account of a conversation, specifically a conversation about the wool of Fleece Hollow Farm, which Mowbray had understood to be particular to this place, in the way that wine is particular to its vineyard, and honey is particular to its meadow, shaped by the specific grasses of the hollow, the specific mineral content of the water from the Fleece Hollow spring, the specific cold of the upland winters that Mowbray believed and had documented over 40 years, produced a longer, finer crimp in the fleece than the same breeds produced at lower elevations in this county. She believed it by the third reading. She believed it the way she believed things that had been argued from evidence by someone who had spent 40 years accumulating the evidence, not as faith, but as a reasonable conclusion from an extraordinary data set. The first neighbor she met was a man named Oke, who grazed sheep on the adjacent property, and who appeared at the Woolshed door on the third day, with a face that combined curiosity and something that took her a moment to identify as relief. He was 57, with the particular physical economy of a person who works outdoors in weather and has learned to conserve every unnecessary expenditure of energy for the weather's sake. He said, "You bought Mabry's shed." She said she had. He said, "Good." And then, "I've been looking at that building for 18 years wondering what was going to happen to it." She said she had found the pit. He went still in the way she had noticed people going still when the pit was mentioned. She would come to understand that the pit was known, locally, as a presence, rather than a specific thing. People knew it was there. They knew it had a lock. And they had respected Mabry Sound's estate instruction in the way that people respect things they do not fully understand, but sense have weight. He said, "Was it what she said it would be?" Evie said, "She didn't say what it would be. She said it was the record of her learning." He nodded slowly. He said, "She talked about it once, to me. She said she had been putting things together for someone who wasn't born yet. I thought she meant an actual heir." A pause. "She meant you, I suppose. Or whoever you were going to be." She asked him about the sheep. He told her about the flock, what had happened to Mabry's animals after she died, dispersed and absorbed into other flocks in the area so that Mabry's particular breeding was not entirely lost. Some of the lines traceable through his own animals. He said if she was thinking about keeping sheep on the hollow, she should know that the grass came back every spring without intervention, and that the hollow's microclimate was, as Mabry had always maintained, genuinely unusual. He said he had always thought Mabry was being eccentric when she talked about the hollow's effect on fleece character, and he had believed her anyway, because he had eaten her lamb and tasted what the hollow did to the meat, and he had been willing to extend the principle. Evie asked if he would be willing to let her work with his flock until she could establish her own. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Can you shear?" She said not yet. He said, "Come Thursday. I'll teach you." She came Thursday. She came every Thursday for 3 months, and by the end of the 3rd month she could shear a sheep without OK correcting her, which was his criterion for sufficiency. She was not fast. Speed came with years, he said. And she had years, but she was clean, meaning the cuts were even and the animal was calm, which was the thing that mattered most. He said Mabry had been one of the cleanest shearers he had ever seen, which was not something he said lightly. She read the notebook in parallel with the shearing lessons, and the two things informed each other in the way that physical practice and theoretical understanding always inform each other when they are held together, each making the other more legible. She began processing Oke's wool with her own hands on the shearing board, using the tools from the pit and the methods from the notebook. And what came out of the processing was different from what she expected, different in texture from anything she had worked with before. With a hand that she kept turning to describe and kept failing to find the right word for, settling finally on honest, which was not a technical textile term but was accurate. She showed a sample to OK. He held it and said nothing for a long moment. He said, "That's Mabry's wool." She said, "It came from your flock." He said, "Yes, and you processed it the way she processed it." He set the sample down. There's a word for that in some traditions. The French have a word, I think, for the way a place and a practice together produce a thing that neither could produce separately. She said, "Terroir." He said, "That's the word." She wrote it in her notebook. She wrote the date beside it, and the specific sample it referred to, and the processing decisions she had made, and what Oki had said, and what she thought it meant. She wrote it in the same angular shorthand she had been unconsciously learning from Mabry Sound's notebook over 3 months of reading. Because handwriting is a contagion, and good habits are as contagious as bad ones. The first year was the hardest in the way that first years of anything genuinely new are hard. Not because of failure, but because of the gap between what she could understand and what she could do. She sheared through the first spring with Okay's flock. She processed the wool by hand. She learned to spin from the drop spindle in the pit, and then from a spinning wheel she found at the county auction. And she learned to dye with the plant materials from the cavity's shelves, and then from materials she gathered on the hollow's slopes, cross-referencing against Mabry's notebook entries on each plant. She failed at things regularly and recorded the failures with the same precision she recorded the successes, because the notebook had taught her that the failures were as important, sometimes more, and because honest record-keeping seemed to make everything else more honest by association. By the second spring, she had a small flock of her own, 6 ewes from Okay, sold at cost. Their lines traceable to Mabry's original breeding in several cases. She named them. Mabry Sound's notebook had not named the animals, being a working record rather than a memoir. But Evie thought names were useful for the same reason labels were useful. They committed you to attending to a specific thing rather than a general category. By the third year, the flock was 12. By the fourth, it was 20. Which was approximately the right scale for a working hollow of 6.4 acres, and she knew this because Mabry's notebook had an entry from 1983 that said, "The hollow carries 20 well. More than 20, and something in the grass changes. I have tried it 3 times. The hollow knows." She tried 22 for 1 season. The hollow knew. The textile community found her the way communities find things that belong to them. Through the work, which spread slowly through the hands of the people who bought it, who talked about it in the specific way that people talk about materials they cannot place in a known category. A gallery in the county seat that sold regional craft put 3 of her woven samples in the window and sold them in the first week, and asked for more. A textile artist named Yenna, who did large-scale fiber installations, drove up the hollow track one Thursday morning with a sample of Evie's yarn in her hand and a specific question about the mordant sequence that had produced the color. And the question was so precisely formed that Evie understood immediately that she was talking to someone who had been working in this territory for a long time. Yenna became what Thad had been for Marin, what Prue had been for Nora at the bone mill, what Thora had been for Wren at the ropemaker's loft. The experienced practitioner who arrives without being summoned and gives what she has without calculating the return. She came to the Woolshed irregularly, on no schedule, and each visit produced something Evie put in her notebook. Once, on a cold Tuesday in November, when the hollow carried the specific quiet of a place that is closed for the winter, Yenna said that good cloth holds the landscape it came from, that you can feel the altitude in upland wool and the salt in coastal linen, and that this was not a metaphor. Evie said Mowbray called it the hollow's contribution. Yenna said she was right. Her father heard about the Woolshed through the regional craft network that had begun to notice what was happening on Fleece Hollow Road, and he came on a Sunday in the second year with the particular manner of a man who is attending to something carefully, because he is not sure what he is looking at, and does not want to reach a conclusion before he has the information. He walked the building and looked at the shearing board and examined the tools from the pit with the practiced attention of a craftsman examining another craftsman's tools. He picked up the small, rigid heddle loom and turned it over in his hands. He said, "This is very well made." Evie said it had been the previous owner's. He set it down. He looked at the 26 preparations laid out on the long table she had set up along the south wall, each in its labeled linen, each with its card. He read several cards. He looked at the notebook, Mabry's, which she kept on the table beside her own, in the same way that Nadia So kept Cress Hollowhans beside hers. The same way that Petra Ward kept Sylvie Crane's beside hers. The same way that each person in these stories keeps the record of the person who left something for them, and he did not touch it, but read the first page where she had left it open. He said, "You're keeping records." She said she was. He said, "Are they accurate?" She said she tried to be honest about what she didn't know as well as what she did. He looked at her. He said, "I told you to try your hand at independence." He paused. The pause had weight. "I didn't expect you to do it this thoroughly." It was, she understood, the closest her father could come to saying he had not understood what he had in front of him, and that he understood it better now. She did not require him to come closer than that. She took what was offered and understood its cost. Her mother came the following weekend. Ruth walked the hollow first, before she came into the building, climbing the ridge and looking back at the Woolshed from above the way you look at something to understand its setting before you understand the thing itself. When she came in, she went directly to the shearing pit and looked down into it. She said, "You went down there." Evie said she had. Her mother said, "Of course you did." She said it with a warmth and a completeness that contained, in 3 words, everything she had not been able to say at the kitchen table. She put her arm around Evie's shoulders and they stood at the edge of the pit and looked into it together for a moment. Then Ruth said, "Show me the wool." Thomas texted a photograph he had seen in a craft publication. The caption named the Woolshed. He said, "Dad wouldn't show me, but I found it." She wrote back, "Come up, sometime." He wrote, "Yeah." He did come, 6 months later, and spent an afternoon on the shearing board learning the hand cards, which he was good at immediately in the way of people who have grown up working with their hands. He came back. He is still coming back. She had started doing what Mabry Sound had done in the years before the hatch had been her only option. She had started giving fleece away, not the processed preparations. Those were the work, and the work supported the life, and she was honest with herself about that. But raw fleece, at shearing time, to anyone who asked, and she had made it known that anyone could ask. The word had traveled in the way these things travel, and people came to the hollow at shearing time the way people go to orchards at picking time, with a purpose and a willingness to work, and a gratitude that was not servile but reciprocal. Understanding that the fleece was a gift from the land as much as from her. One of the people who came at shearing time was a girl of 17 who had come with an older woman from a fiber arts program at a county school, and who had stood at the edge of the shearing board watching Evie work, and had said almost nothing the entire morning except, at the end, when the last animal was done, "Can I come back?" Evie had said yes. She had come back. She had come back every Thursday since, which had been a year and a half ago, and she was now learning to shear on the same flock where Evie had learned. Because Oki, when Evie asked, had said, "The flock can teach one more." The girl's name was Rowan. She was keeping a notebook. It is 4 years now since Evie Mast sat across from Odette and put a $1 bill on the counter and asked for the deed to a woolshed that had been unloved for 18 years on 6 acres of upland grassland that smelled, in perpetuity and through decades of vacancy, of lanolin. The hollow is what it was built to be, a working sheep station, small, precise, specific to its land. The flock is 20, the right number, as Mabry had known in 1983, and as Evie confirmed for herself with the season of 22, the hollow knowing what it knew. The shearing board has been replaced in the warped sections, and is sound. The pit is clear and open, and the hatch is there but no longer locked, because what was in it is now on the table, and in the notebooks, and in the hands of people who are learning it. Mowbray Sound's 26 preparations are still on the long table, still in their linen, still labeled. Because they belong on the table and not in storage. They are a working reference, consulted regularly. The standard against which Evie measures her own work, and occasionally, when a preparation meets the standard, makes a mark in her notebook, and feels the particular satisfaction of having done a thing correctly. Beside them, Evie's own preparations grow in number, each labeled in the angular shorthand she learned from Mowbray without knowing she was learning it. The notebooks sit together, Mowbray's and Evie's, and now the beginning of Rowan's, thin and new at the end of the shelf, its pages mostly empty. Its first entry in handwriting that is not yet sure of itself, but is already honest about what it doesn't know. The hollow fills with light in the morning and with shadow by mid-afternoon, which is the nature of hollows. The sheep move through it with the unhurried purpose of animals that know their ground. The spring comes through a limestone formation at the east side of the flock enclosure and runs into a stone trough that Mowbray Sound built in 1974 and that has been running clean and continuous since then. Evie drinks from it most mornings. The water tastes of the limestone and of the hollow and of 44 years of Mowbray Sound's attention to what this particular piece of land produces and what it asks in return. She has been trying to write that taste into the notebook for 4 years. She has not yet found the right words. She keeps trying. There is a kind of inheritance that is not about objects or skills or even knowledge, though it contains all three. It is about a relationship between a person and a specific piece of land, understood deeply enough and honestly enough to be written down, handed forward, continued. Mowbray Sound spent 44 years building that relationship, and then she put the record of it in the lowest part of her working building and waited, because she understood that a person who goes down into a shearing pit to find out what is there is a person who does not stop at the surface, and that the surface is where most things stop. Evie Mast was 19 years old, and she had $31, and $1 of it had bought a woolshed. She went down into the pit. She found the hatch. She opened it. She is still descending, every day, into the specific understanding of what this land is, and what it grows, and what can be made from what it grows. She has not reached the bottom of that yet. She does not think she will. She does not think Mowbray did either. That is not a problem. That is the work. If Evie's story stayed with you tonight, please share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe to Quiet Road Stories if you haven't yet. The button is just below. And here is our question for this evening. Has there ever been a place, a piece of land, a building, a room that taught you something that you could not have learned anywhere else? Tell us in the comments. We are always reading. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.